The diner at dawn. The morning sky was still dark blue when Keanu Reeves pushed open the glass door of Miller's diner. A cold wind slipped in behind him as he stepped inside, wearing a plain hoodie, jeans, and sneakers so worn they had holes in them. His beard was slightly grown out and his hair hung messily over his forehead. No one would have guessed this man was a Hollywood legend. He looked like just another tired traveler, maybe someone who had slept in his car or wandered in from the street. And that's exactly what he wanted. Keanu didn't come here for attention. He came because this diner, small, tucked between a gas station and a hardware store on the edge of town, was quiet. It reminded him of the places he used to visit when life was simpler, when he could drink coffee without someone snapping photos or asking about his next movie. He sat in the far booth near the window and glanced at the empty street outside. Everything felt still, peaceful, until they walked in. Two local police officers entered the diner with loud boots and louder voices. They wore the kind of confidence that came from power, and they scanned the room with practiced eyes. Officer Dixon, tall and broad, led the way. Behind him was Officer Riley, younger, slimmer, with a buzz cut and a smirk that never quite left his face. They were regulars here, and the waitress, Nancy, knew it. She rushed over with smiles and coffee cups before Keanu could even look at the menu. The officers sat 2 booths away from him. They didn't notice him at first, but then Officer Riley tilted his head, narrowed his eyes, and leaned in. "Hey, Dixon," he muttered. "You see that guy over there?" Dixon turned, looked once, and shrugged. "Bum?" "Probably," Riley replied, his voice just loud enough to carry. "He looks like he crawled out of a shelter. Maybe we should ask what he's doing here." Keanu didn't react. He kept his eyes on the menu, quietly sipping water from the glass in front of him. Years in Hollywood had taught him patience. He didn't need to answer every insult, but he noticed Nancy shift uncomfortably behind the counter. She knew who he was. She'd served him twice before, always quiet, always respectful. But she didn't say anything this time. Maybe she didn't want trouble. Maybe she was scared of losing her job. Riley stood up, stretched, and made his way to Keanu's booth. He placed both hands on the table, leaned in, and said with fake politeness, "Sir, do you have a reason for being here? You ordering something or just loitering?" Keanu looked up slowly, his eyes calm, gentle even. "Just waiting to order, same as anyone else." Riley scoffed. "You sure about that? Got money on you?" Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet. He opened it and showed a crisp 20. "Yes," he said simply. Dixon joined them, crossing his arms. "You got ID?" Keanu nodded, pulled out a driver's license, and handed it over. Riley took one look at it and blinked. Something in his expression changed, but he tried to hide it. He handed it back quickly and cleared his throat. "Doesn't mean you can hang out all morning," Dixon muttered. "People like you make others uncomfortable." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "People like me?" "Yeah," Riley added with a smirk. "You know, the unwashed, weird-looking types. Not exactly good for business." The diner grew quiet. A few other customers turned to look, frowning. One old man near the door shook his head but stayed silent. Nancy bit her lip behind the counter, her eyes flicking between Keanu and the officers. Keanu leaned back and gave a soft sigh. "I didn't mean to make anyone uncomfortable. I just came for coffee and some quiet." "Then maybe take your coffee to go," Riley snapped. "Or better yet, take a walk." Keanu stood slowly, not in anger but in a way that made the air around him feel heavier. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, one that looked old and worn. He set it on the table and opened it with care. Inside were neatly stacked pages, documents, photos, newspaper clippings. At the top of the stack was a printed memo stamped and signed by the mayor's office. Officer Dixon glanced at the folder and frowned. "What's that supposed to be?" Keanu didn't speak. He just turned the folder so they could read it. Dixon stepped closer, squinted at the papers, and then his face went pale. "Is this real?" he asked, voice suddenly uncertain. Riley grabbed the folder and scanned the top page. Then his hands trembled slightly. The signature was real. The letterhead was real. The document clearly stated that Keanu Reeves had been appointed as the town's official cultural ambassador and had recently donated nearly $500,000 toward building a new shelter for veterans and struggling families. It also stated he was to be treated as a respected guest during his private stay in the area. Dixon took a step back. "Why didn't you say anything?" Keanu looked at him with the same calm eyes. "Because people shouldn't have to prove their worth to be treated with basic respect." No one spoke for several seconds. The air was thick with tension. Even the radio in the corner had fallen silent. The officer stood there unsure of what to say. Behind them, Nancy slowly walked over and placed a hot coffee and a fresh plate of pancakes on Keanu's table. "On the house?" she said gently, her eyes meeting his with quiet apology. Keanu nodded with a kind smile. "Thank you." As he sat back down and took a sip, the officers returned to their booth without another word. Their faces were red, their posture stiff. They knew they had made a mistake, but pride kept their mouths shut. The other diners whispered softly, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others watching Keanu with new eyes. But Keanu didn't want attention. He didn't gloat. He simply turned back to the window, looking out at the street as if nothing had happened. What no one knew yet, what even Nancy didn't see, was the photo tucked behind the folder. It showed a young girl smiling brightly next to a small sign that read, "Thank you, Keanu, for saving my dad." The man in the background was a homeless veteran, now living in one of the homes Keanu had quietly helped build. But that story, too, would soon come out, and when it did, the entire town would remember this morning forever. Whispers in the quiet town. The sun had climbed above the hills by the time Keanu stepped out of the diner, the cold breeze brushing against his face. He didn't look back. Not at the officers who sat in silence, not at the whispers that followed his exit, not even at the grateful glance Nancy gave him from behind the counter. The encounter had stirred something in the town, an invisible ripple, like the first quiet movement before a storm. People would talk, they always did, but Keanu had learned long ago that actions stayed longer than words. He walked slowly down the sidewalk, passing the worn-out buildings of a town that had seen better days. The paint on the bookstore window was chipped. The benches near the park were crooked and rusted. The community center stood closed with a big red notice pinned to the door. Budget cuts, someone had told him. No funding left for after-school programs or weekend meals for the elderly. And yet, money was always there for other things. New patrol cars, shiny billboards, political campaigns. Keanu knew this because he had read the reports. Quietly, from behind the scenes, he had followed the trail of where the money went. He had visited the veterans' shelters, the foster homes, the food pantries. He had spoken to those who didn't have a voice, an elderly man named Charles who lived out of his truck, a single mother named Marta who cleaned offices after midnight, a teenager named Jake who had dropped out of school to work 2 jobs. None of them asked for pity, they only asked for a fair chance. And that's why Keanu was here. Not to be recognized, not to be praised, but because somewhere in this town the system had cracked, and no one seemed to care enough to fix it. He made his way to a small brick building tucked behind the courthouse. There was no sign on the door, no receptionist, no security, just a single worn-out desk and a stack of files. This was where he worked during his private time in town, voluntarily, anonymously, away from cameras and flashing lights. He called it the quiet desk. On it were letters, receipts, and plans. Taped to the wall were blueprints for a new community garden, sketches of a public library for kids, and a proposal for a safe house for abused women. He sat down, opened his laptop, and began reviewing the latest budget allocations from the city council. He wasn't supposed to have access to these, but an old friend from the mayor's office had quietly granted him the data. And what he found made him shake his head. Another $30,000 for town beautification, which meant flowers and fountains in front of rich neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the senior home on Elm Street had broken heaters and no working elevator. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He looked up. It was Sarah, a young woman in her 20s with a clipboard in hand and eyes that always seemed a little too tired for someone her age. She had been working with Keanu for months, handling outreach, organizing volunteers, and keeping records of every dollar spent on charity. She wasn't from the town originally, but ever since her brother died of an overdose here, she had stayed, determined to make things better. "You're not going to like this," she said as she stepped in, shutting the door behind her. Keanu leaned back in his chair. "What happened?" Sarah handed him a printed sheet. "Someone tipped off the sheriff's office. They think you're meddling in city business. They've started asking questions about the shelter funding. They might try to shut you down." Keanu read the sheet. It was an internal memo flagged urgent. Potential interference by external party. Investigating unauthorized access to financial documents. It didn't name him directly, but it didn't need to. "They're scared," Keanu said quietly. "We're exposing what they don't want people to see." "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "But they're powerful, and they're getting angry." Keanu folded the paper and placed it in a drawer. "Let them be angry. We didn't come here to please them. We came here to change lives." Sarah nodded, but her worry was visible. "They're planning a meeting tonight. Private. Only city. Officials and selected guests. Rumor is they want to blacklist you. Maybe even use legal channels. Then maybe it's time I stopped being silent," Keanu said, his voice steady. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the town's elite gathered at the Civic Hall. The parking lot was filled with sleek cars, men in suits, and women in polished heels. Inside the hall, under the glow of chandeliers, the mood was tense. The mayor, a balding man with sharp eyes, stood at the podium. Behind him were the council members, and in the back corner stood officers Dixon and Riley, arms crossed, eyes cold. They didn't know Keanu was coming. When he walked through the doors, still in his hoodie, still looking like just another man off the street, every eye turned, conversations paused, whispers spread like wildfire. The mayor's voice faltered. Excuse me, sir. This is a private event." Keanu walked forward calmly. "I know, but I believe everyone should hear this." Riley stepped forward, blocking his path. "You're not on the list." "You're right," Keanu replied. "I'm not, but I am on your city budget reports listed as the anonymous donor behind 5 community projects, and I've come to speak on behalf of those who couldn't get an invite tonight." Gasps filled the room. Some council members leaned forward, confused. The mayor's face turned red. Keanu reached into his bag and pulled out a flash drive. He held it up. "This contains records of where your money is going, and where it isn't. I've sent copies to every local news outlet. By tomorrow morning, the whole town will know." "You can't do that," the mayor snapped. "You'll ruin everything." "No," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll save it." Then he turned and left, not waiting for applause, not looking for attention. Outside, the air was cold again, but this time it felt different. Something had shifted. Sarah met him on the sidewalk, tears in her eyes. "They're going to hate you for this." Keanu looked at her, his face soft. "I don't need them to love me, I just need them to do the right thing." And as they walked away together, neither of them noticed the young boy watching from across the street. A boy holding a crumpled photo of his father in uniform. A boy who would soon come to Keanu with a question that would change everything. The boy with the folded flag the next morning began with silence, but not the peaceful kind. It was the silence of tension, like the hush before a courtroom verdict or the breath held before lightning strikes. The Civic Hall incident had spread like wildfire. By dawn, everyone in town had heard whispers about the mysterious man who exposed the council. Some called him a hero, others a troublemaker. The mayor's office refused to comment, and Officer Dixon had already filed a complaint accusing Keanu of trespassing and public disruption. But Keanu didn't waste his time with the noise. He returned to his quiet desk where the real work waited. The night had changed something inside him, though. He could feel it in his chest, a weight he hadn't carried since the early days of his career. when he still believed one person could truly change the course of an entire town. He had learned the hard way that most systems didn't break. They were built broken, and fixing them meant shaking the roots, even if it meant standing alone. He was staring at the new volunteer applications when the door creaked open. It was slow, uncertain. He expected Sarah, maybe a council member or even an officer sent to intimidate him. But instead, he saw a small boy, no older than 10, messy dark hair, oversized coat, a look in his eyes that didn't belong to a child. Keanu stood slowly, surprised. "Hey there, are you lost?" The boy didn't speak. He just stepped forward and held something out. It was a tightly folded American flag, worn around the edges, and tucked into the crease was an old photograph, faded, but clear enough to show a man in army uniform smiling beside a child. The man's eyes were full of life, his smile wide and proud. Keanu took the flag gently, looking from it to the photo, then back to the boy. "This is your dad?" The boy nodded once, then he finally spoke. "They buried him last year. Said he died from complications, but he really died because nobody helped." Keanu knelt down so they were eye level. "What do you mean?" The boy's voice cracked as he spoke, but he didn't cry. Not yet. He was homeless, got sick. The shelter was full. The hospital made him wait outside. They said he didn't have insurance. By the time someone noticed, it was too late. Keanu's throat tightened. He had heard versions of this story before, too many times. Veterans left behind, families shattered, systems designed to forget them. "What's your name?" Keanu asked softly. "Elijah." "Why did you come here, Elijah?" The boy pulled out a second paper from his pocket. It was a wrinkled flyer, one of the ones Sarah had printed and pinned around town. It listed services for veterans, families, and trauma support, with Keanu's foundation name at the bottom. "Someone at school gave me this," Elijah said. "They said you help people. I thought, maybe you could help me prove my dad wasn't a nobody." Keanu looked down at the flyer, then at the boy's face, then at the flag. "He wasn't a nobody," he said quietly, "and we're going to make sure this whole town remembers who he was." They sat together for an hour. Keanu asked questions. Elijah answered with quiet strength. Sarah arrived halfway through and joined them. By the end of the morning, they had the beginnings of a plan. A memorial, yes, but something bigger. A public campaign to honor forgotten veterans. Their names, their faces, their stories. It wouldn't bring them back, but it would shine light on everything this town tried to keep in the dark. But as word spread of Keanu's next move, the backlash began. First came the letters, anonymous typed threats. "Leave town. You're not welcome here. Stop poking your nose where it doesn't belong." Then came the vandalism. The front door of the quiet desk was sprayed with red paint. "Traitor," scrawled across it in dripping letters. Someone slashed the tires on Keanu's old car. Another smashed a window and left a pile of burned photos behind. Sarah was shaken, but not surprised. "They're scared," she said as she cleaned up the mess. "They think if they break you, the rest of us will stop." Keanu didn't say much. He simply taped a sign over the vandalized window. It read, "The more you try to silence the truth, the louder it becomes." But the final blow came later that week. Officer Riley showed up at the quiet desk with 2 other deputies armed with a warrant. They claimed there had been reports of illegal data access, violation of privacy laws, and tampering with government files. They forced Sarah out of the building, pushed past Keanu, and began seizing computers, boxes, and documents. "You're making a mistake," Keanu said calmly. Riley smirked. "No, you did. You thought you could walk into our town and act like some kind of savior. But we know what you're really doing, building a cult, stirring up drama, poisoning people against their leaders." Keanu stepped aside as they ransacked the room. But as Riley reached for the drawer, the one with Elijah's flag, Keanu's hand shot out fast, firm, unshakable. "Not that," he said, his voice low. Riley looked him in the eye. There was a flicker of something there. Hesitation? Guilt? Or maybe just the realization that Keanu wasn't afraid. Fine, Riley muttered. Keep your little souvenir, it won't save you. They left with files, hard drives, and boxes. Sarah returned minutes later, her face pale. They're trying to shut us down. Legally, financially, everything. Keanu stood in the broken office, surrounded by silence once again. But this time, the silence didn't feel heavy, it felt clear. Then we go louder, he said. We take it public. We take it to the people. That night, Keanu sat in a borrowed room at the back of a small bookstore, typing out a message. It wasn't a speech, it wasn't a complaint. It was a story. Elijah's story, Charles's story, Marta's story. The names of every person the town had ignored. And at the end, he included one sentence that would shake the town's foundation. Fire for. Ones in uniform dishonored their own by humiliating the man trying to honor the fallen. He hit send. The post went viral. Overnight, it spread across platforms shared by thousands, seen by millions. People from other towns, other countries began flooding the town's page with questions, anger, support. Reporters started calling. The mayor's office went silent. Officer Riley's name trended, but not in the way he wanted, and in the center of it all was a photo, not of Keanu, but of a small boy, standing beside a folded flag, with a sign that read, "My dad was a hero. Thank you for not forgetting." The storm they didn't expect in the days that followed Keanu's viral post. The town of Redefines found itself in a storm it hadn't prepared for. A town once hidden in the shadows of political silence and routine corruption was now burning under the light of national attention. News vans lined up along Main Street. Reporters knocked on the doors of council members, and every local resident found themselves under a microscope. But in the middle of all the chaos, the man who started it all remained calm. Keanu stayed in the background. He wasn't giving interviews or holding press conferences. Instead, he was helping Elijah hang photos of veterans along the walls of a local shelter. Each frame had a name, a rank, and a simple quote from someone who remembered them. Sarah worked beside him, organizing letters from people across the country. Some were survivors of similar injustice. Others were just inspired by the quiet defiance in Keanu's words. People were moved not just by what he did, but by how he did it. But the town's officials had no intention of staying quiet. Behind closed doors, they were scrambling. The mayor, red-faced and sweating, called an emergency meeting. Officer Riley was there, seated next to Dixon, who had grown visibly more nervous in recent days. Councilwoman Parsons, usually quiet, now demanded answers. "You said this man was a nuisance," she snapped. "You didn't say he had the country watching us." Riley clenched his jaw. "We handled it the way we were supposed to. We didn't know he'd pull a media stunt." "This isn't a stunt," another council member said grimly. "This is truth. And the people are listening." The mayor slammed his palm on the table. "So what do? We can't arrest him. We can't sue him. The man's got lawyers from 3 states offering pro bono defense, and now veterans groups are threatening protests." They all sat in silence until Officer Dixon, staring down at the table, spoke quietly. "We apologize." Heads turned, Riley scoffed. "You've lost your mind." "No," Dixon said, his voice shaky. "I've seen the letters. I've seen what people are saying. And I've seen what we did. We were wrong. Maybe if we'd treated him like a person instead of a problem, none of this would have happened." Riley stood furious. "You're turning your back on us?" Dixon didn't respond. Outside the council room, the atmosphere in town was changing too. More and more people had started coming to the shelter Keanu helped restore. Teenagers volunteered, after school. An elderly woman named Ruth began baking bread for the staff and guests every morning. A local teacher organized an art project where students painted murals of veterans across town walls. And all of it, every small act, was being quietly coordinated from Keanu's once broken, now crowded office, rebuilt with donations from across the country. But not everyone was pleased. Late one evening, as Keanu locked up the shelter, he noticed a man standing across the street. Tall, heavy boots, coat zipped up to his chin, face hidden beneath a baseball cap. Keanu watched him for a moment, feeling something shift in his gut. He wasn't just a passerby. He was watching, studying. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared. Keanu took a step forward, but before he could say anything, the man turned and walked away into the dark. Keanu didn't tell Sarah. He didn't want to alarm her. But he knew enough to recognize when trouble was brewing again. Not in public, but in the shadows. The kind of trouble that didn't leave evidence, only consequences. The next day, trouble arrived in the form of a lawsuit. A letter delivered by hand accused Keanu of defamation, invasion of privacy, and disruption of public order. It was signed not by the mayor, but by an influential developer named Thomas Blake, someone Keanu had never met. The man owned half the buildings in Red Pines and had deep ties to council members, police contracts, and land deals. The letter demanded Keanu leave town. Immediately, Sarah read it with trembling hands. "We can't fight this, not without money, not without a team." Keanu looked at the letter, then at the window where the veterans' mural now covered the alley wall. "We're not fighting it alone." And he was right. When news of the lawsuit hit social media, something unexpected happened. Hundreds of people, then thousands, began posting under a single hashtag. Stand with Keanu. Celebrities. War veterans. Single mothers. Students. People from all walks of life. They flooded the mayor's inbox, tagged the city council, sent donations to the shelter. Even national figures began speaking out. And yet, the pressure didn't stop the powerful. One evening, Keanu received a call. Private number. No voice on the other end, just static. Then a robotic message played. "You have until Sunday. Leave, or be erased." Sarah wanted to report it. Keanu refused. "They want fear," he said. "We'll give them resolve." But Sunday came with more than a threat. Keanu was scheduled to give a speech at a veterans' memorial service in the town square. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about revenge. It was about memory. He had worked all week with Elijah on writing the speech. The boy had even practiced reading a part of it. The square was packed, not just locals, but people who had driven from other towns, other counties. Flags waved, candles burned, cameras rolled. As Keanu stepped up to the microphone, Elijah beside him, the crowd fell silent. Keanu began, "We are not here today because of anger. We are here because of love. Love for those forgotten, for those silenced, for those who gave, and were never given back." But he didn't finish the sentence. A sudden sound cut through the air. Loud, fast. Glass shattered behind the stage. People screamed. Security rushed forward. Someone had thrown a brick. It missed Keanu by inches. The note tied to it read, "Leave before we bury more." Police cleared the crowd. Reporters rushed to cover the chaos. But Keanu, unshaken, stood still, his hand on Elijah's shoulder, his voice unbroken. He turned to the boy and whispered, "You okay?" Elijah nodded, though his hands trembled. Keanu walked back to the mic. "You can scare people with violence, but you cannot erase the truth, and you cannot erase the memory of those we're here to honor." Then he handed the mic to Elijah. The boy stepped up, voice small but brave. "My dad was a soldier. He didn't die in war. He died here because nobody helped. But today, I know he didn't die for nothing." The crowd stood. Many cried. Even Officer Dixon, standing in the back, wiped his eyes. Behind the crowd, in a dark alley, the man in the baseball cap watched again. Only this time, he wasn't alone. He pulled out a phone. "We'll have to do it ourselves," he said to the man beside him. "If the system won't stop him, we will." The man behind the curtain, the events at the memorial, sent shockwaves far beyond the small borders of Red Pines. News outlets spun the story into every direction. Some hailed Keanu as a modern hero. Others painted him as a disruptive figure shaking the roots of tradition. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the middle. Keanu hadn't set out to become a symbol. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was chasing justice. But now justice had a cost, and the people pulling strings in the background were preparing to collect. 3 days after the brick attack, Keanu sat in the back office of a borrowed church, his hands resting on a folder filled with letters from strangers. Children, veterans, mothers, teachers. Some letters were printed, others handwritten with shaky pens. They all carried the same message: don't stop. But even with all the support, Keanu felt the weight of what was coming. He could sense it. The silence from City Hall wasn't surrender, it was strategy. They were waiting, planning something. Precise. Something quiet. Sarah entered the room holding her phone. Her face was pale, her voice barely a whisper. They've frozen our funding account. Keanu looked up slowly. What? The shelter's donations. All of them. Gone. Someone filed a complaint, and the processing service froze everything. Pending investigation. Keanu stood and took the phone. The message on the screen was clear. Suspicious activity flagged. Reviewing transactions for potential fraud. It was nonsense. All records were clean, transparent. But it didn't matter. This wasn't about fraud. It was about pressure. They're bleeding us out, Sarah said. No money means no food. No medicine, no outreach. They're cutting us off piece by piece. Keanu didn't reply right away. He walked to the window and looked out at the street. Children were playing across the road. The mural on the alley wall had been defaced again, spray-painted. Insults and black streaks across the faces of veterans. A shadow fell over his heart. This wasn't just resistance anymore. It was war, and it was getting personal. That night, as he left the church, Keanu noticed a figure waiting by his car. Not the man in the baseball cap. Someone older, shorter, dressed in a long overcoat and leaning on a cane. The stranger didn't move as Keanu approached. He simply looked up and gave a slight nod. Mr. Reeves, the man said, his voice gravelly. My name is Thomas Blake. Keanu paused. This was the man who signed the lawsuit. The one behind the curtain. I assume this isn't a friendly visit, Keanu said calmly. Blake smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I came to offer you an exit. Keanu narrowed his gaze. You think I'll take it? I think you should, Blake said. You're stirring up unrest. People are turning on each other. My business partners are concerned. My lawyers are frustrated, but me? I'm just practical. You're bleeding the town dry, Keanu said. You hide behind paperwork and politics while people sleep in alleys. And yet you're the one they worship, Blake sneered. An actor playing a role he doesn't understand. This town wasn't built for change. It was built to protect itself. Keanu stepped closer, his voice firm. Then maybe it's time someone tore it down and rebuilt it right. Blake's smile faded. You have until Friday. After that, the gloves come off. As he turned and walked away, Keanu felt something in the air shift again, this time sharper, more final. Blake wasn't bluffing. Friday wasn't just a threat, it was a deadline. The next day, things moved quickly. City inspectors showed up at the shelter, citing bogus health code violations. Eviction notices appeared on the doors of families supported by Keanu's foundation. Local media, once supportive, now aired exclusive investigations filled with misleading claims. Officer Riley was suddenly seen more often near the shelter, parked across the street watching with cold eyes. But even in the face of rising fear, Keanu didn't back down. He met with community leaders, organized emergency food drives, and held meetings with lawyers offering to challenge Blake's empire. He called veterans organizations and filed appeals to unfreeze the donations. He worked through the night with Sarah and Elijah, never once showing the exhaustion that weighed down his bones. It was during one of those long nights that Elijah, still barely 10 years old, looked up from coloring in the corner of the office and asked, "Why do they hate you so much if you're trying to help?" Keanu paused, then sat beside him. "Because some people build their lives on power, not truth," he said. "And when you shine a light, they're afraid people will see how hollow that power really is." Elijah frowned. "So they try to break the light?" "Yes," Keanu nodded. "But the thing about light? It finds a way, even through cracks." Friday came like a storm on the horizon. Early that morning, an anonymous tip led to a raid. Again. Officers entered the shelter and claimed to be searching for illegal materials. They broke into supply closets, ripped open donation boxes, scattered food and clothing everywhere. Sarah cried when they overturned a box of letters from veterans. Elijah watched from the hallway, silent, holding his dad's folded flag. Keanu didn't yell, didn't curse. He simply stood at the door and watched them leave. But when the dust settled, he made a choice. That afternoon, Keanu walked to City Hall. No cameras, no reporters, just him and a file in his hand. The receptionist tried to block him, but he pushed forward. He entered the mayor's office uninvited. The mayor stood up, startled. "You can't be here." "I can," Keanu said, setting the file on the desk. Inside this are testimonies, photos, letters, and a copy of every illegal transaction Thomas Blake has made through your office. If you don't call off the attacks, I'll go federal. And trust me, I won't need a stage or a script to tell that story. The mayor opened the file. As he flipped through the contents, his face went from confused to pale to horrified. "How? Did you get this?" "You gave it to me," Keanu said. "You just didn't know it." The mayor sat down slowly. For the first time, he looked afraid. Keanu turned to leave. But as he reached the door, he stopped. "One more thing," he said. "You tell your officers, if they ever humiliate another stranger for how they look, they better be ready to explain it in court." As Keanu walked back down the steps of City Hall, he didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if they would retaliate harder or finally give in. But he knew this. The battle had shifted. They weren't just afraid of his voice now. They were afraid of the truth he carried. But what Keanu didn't know, what no one knew, was that Thomas Blake wasn't finished. In a room beneath an old law firm, Blake sat with two men in suits, sliding a photo across the table. "If we can't ruin his reputation," he said, his voice ice cold, "we'll ruin his life." And the photo was of someone Keanu thought he'd never see again. The face from the ashes, the photo on the table was old, creased down the middle, but the eyes in it were unmistakable. They stared back at Thomas Blake like a ghost. Watchful, unblinking, impossible to forget. The woman in the picture had soft features, a warm smile, and a scar just beneath her right eyebrow. To most people, it was just another face. But Blake knew better, and so did the two men in suits who leaned forward with interest as he tapped the photo. "This is his sister," Blake said coldly. "The one no one knows about. Not the media, not the public, not even her real name." One of the men raised an eyebrow. "You sure it's her?" "Positive," Blake replied. "She disappeared from the public years ago after a breakdown, lived under a new identity, moved to small towns, ran shelters anonymously. Keanu helped cover her trail, and if this gets out, people will start asking why a man preaching truth kept this secret." He slid a folder across the table. "Dig. Find anything. A mistake, a file, a charge, anything you can turn into noise. We don't need proof, just smoke." And just like that, the final attack was in motion. Meanwhile, KeanuReeves sat on the rooftop of the restored shelter, watching the sunset burn across the sky. The town had been strangely quiet since the confrontation at City Hall. City officials were retreating. Officers no longer loitered near the building. Council meetings were being held behind locked doors. It all felt too calm. Sarah joined him on the roof with 2 cups of tea. She looked tired. So did he. "You really scared them," she said, handing him a cup. "Not enough," Keanu replied. "Not yet." They sat in silence for a while. Down below, children played by the mural. An elderly man watered the plants in the new community garden. A teenage girl painted a new face onto the mural wall, Elijah's father. "We're making something here," Sarah said. "Something real." "That's why they'll try to tear it down," Keanu said softly. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed. She read the message and froze. "You need to see this." Keanu took the phone. On the screen was a post from a major gossip outlet. It showed the photo of his sister. The headline read, Keanu Reeves' secret family. Why is Hollywood's hero hiding this woman? Beneath it were insinuations, mental health issues, financial fraud, strange travel history, lies buried in half-truths. Keanu stood up slowly. The tea in his hand was forgotten. They found her, he whispered. His sister, Mira, had vanished from public life almost 15 years ago after a violent stalking incident nearly cost her everything. The trauma shattered her. She changed. Her name relocated and tried to start over. Keanu had protected her in silence, funding her healing quietly, never speaking of her publicly, not to keep her hidden, but to keep her safe. And now, she was exposed. By midnight, photos were everywhere. Online rumors multiplied. Reporters swarmed the shelter gates shouting questions. Camera flashes burst like gunfire. Sarah barricaded the office. Elijah cried in the corner, confused. Keanu stood at the window, watching everything collapse in slow motion. "What do we do?" Sarah asked. Keanu turned to her, eyes calm but fierce. "We do what we've always done. We tell the truth." And the next morning he did. Keanu held a public meeting, not in front of reporters, but inside the shelter. Local residents, volunteers, veterans, and strangers came. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of loyalty. Keanu stood in front of a hand-painted flag on the wall. Beside him was a projector showing photos not of his sister but of the town. Broken buildings, children in shelters, the faces of those he'd helped. "I want to talk about secrets," he began. The room fell silent. "Yes, I have a sister. Yes, she disappeared from the spotlight. Not because we were ashamed of her, but because the world refused to let her heal in peace. She was attacked, stalked, and nearly broken. I chose silence to protect her, not to deceive you. And if that makes me guilty, so be it." He took a deep breath. "But while they talk about my sister's past, ask yourself, why aren't they talking about the elderly man with no heat last winter? The single mother whose car was towed after her night shift? The teenager who dropped out because he couldn't afford school lunches? Why are they digging through my family's past instead of fixing the present?" He looked at the crowd. Some had tears in their eyes. Others nodded slowly. This town doesn't need more secrets. It needs accountability. It needs compassion. It needs light. And if protecting my sister's life was a crime, then let my sentence be the work I've done here. Applause started slowly. Then it grew, louder, fiercer. People stood up. Strangers embraced. Even former critics clapped. The moment reached beyond the shelter walls. Someone live-streamed the speech. It went viral. Celebrities reposted it. Veterans groups issued statements of support. The media narrative flipped. Suddenly, Blake's smear campaign collapsed under the weight of Keanu's honesty. Within days, investigators opened an inquiry into the city council. Anonymous leaks pointed to Blake's property fraud, his tax evasions, his shady land purchases. Officer Riley resigned under pressure. Officer Dixon came forward with a sworn statement. The mayor? He vanished from public view. And Thomas Blake? He was arrested a week later, charged with conspiracy, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. In his home, agents found files tracing years of manipulation, land theft, and coercion. One file was labeled Keanu Reeves. Another, Project Silence. Both were used as evidence against him in court. But none of that mattered to Keanu, because on a quiet Thursday morning, his sister Mira walked into the shelter wearing a warm coat and a nervous smile. Her hands trembled. Her eyes were wide. But she was there, and Keanu embraced her like the world had disappeared. "You didn't have to do all this for me," she whispered. He pulled back and looked into her eyes. "It wasn't just for you," he said. "It was for everyone who was told to hide, who was shamed, who was silenced, and for the next kid who walks into this place with nothing but a folded flag." That afternoon, Mira spoke to a room full of survivors. She said 5 words that would later be painted on every wall of every shelter Keanu helped build. "He saw me. I healed." Months passed. The town of Red Pines changed. The shelter became a model for others across the country. Keanu stayed quietly, never asking for praise. The diner where it all began now had a photo of Keanu, Nancy, and Elijah hanging on the wall with the words, "Everyone deserves a seat." Officer Dixon joined a veteran support group. Sarah launched a foundation in her brother's name. And Elijah? He got a scholarship. One fall evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Keanu sat on a bench outside the shelter. A girl approached him shyly, holding a drawing. It was of him, surrounded by stars and smiling people. "Who are all these?" he asked. "They're the people you saved," she said. "My mom said you're a hero." Keanu smiled softly and looked at the drawing. "No," he said. "I'm just someone who stayed when it got hard." The wind blew gently through the trees, and the town, once built on silence, now echoed with voices, strong, steady, and finally free.